Hello, and welcome to our latest edition of Our Future in Space. My name is Jeff Greenblatt. I'm your host and the Vice President for Science and Research at Orbital Assembly Corporation. In this podcast, we explore the technical, economic, moral, political, and ethical considerations of moving large numbers of people into the solar system to work, play, and ultimately to live. Our species is at an inflection point in its evolution where we now have the ability to sustain life off planet in low Earth orbit and soon throughout the solar system. Do we merely survive on planet Earth or expand outwards into the solar system and thrive? I'm here with my co-host, Eric Ward, the Vice President for Engineering Design at Orbital Assembly Corporation. Hey, Eric, how's it going?
Hey, I'm doing just great, Jeff. Today we're joined by our guest, Professor Matt Weinzierl. He's a professor at Harvard Business School and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research focuses on the optimal design of economic policy, in particular taxation, with an emphasis on better understanding the philosophical principles underlying these policy choices. He's recently launched economiesofspace.com, which is a set of research projects focused on the commercialization of the space sector and its economic implications. Professor Weinzierl, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Eric and Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. So to get started, as a tax economist, what got you interested in space?
Yeah, it's a natural question. They're not obviously connected. Two things. So I teach a course at the business school on the role of economic policy, the role of government in the economy. And I'm interested in how the public and private sectors interact. And around the time when I was teaching this course for the first time, SpaceX was starting to land rockets on barges in the ocean. And as someone who had thought of the space sector as largely a public sector enterprise, I started to get interested in what was happening here at the intersection of the public and private. So that's the sort of more prosaic economist answer. The deeper answer, which ties right into what Jeff opened the show with, is that my research in economics is about, and the reason I got so interested in economics is about how we can use economic policy and the structure of economic society and society more generally to govern ourselves and live more successful lives. When I think about space and I think about expanding the human presence into space, it's just an incredible opportunity to think in new ways on blank slates about how we structure societies far off in the future. So that's the romantic part of why I'm interested in it.
Absolutely.
That's a very good reason.
Yeah, that's the romantic part of why Jeff and I do this too. It's
Yep.
the point of this podcast is kind of ask those questions. How can it be different? As this blank slate. So, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't mean to jump in, but we talk in my class all the time about folks who have a more libertarian angle on things, folks who have a more I guess you'd say socialist angle on things, and everywhere in between. And space, at least at some point, will offer us the chance to try all these options out. We can run different societies along different principles and see how they work. In a way, we'll have a way to run experiments in the social sciences in the way that natural scientists take for granted.
Absolutely. You've talked about this class and these different types of societies and different ways you can structure policy and taxation. Could you give us some examples of what are some of these interesting, exciting experiments we could do when we're working with, large, blank slate civilizations really in space?
Sure, there's a million. I mean, that's part of the beauty. But let me maybe give two examples. So, one I think is that we often have this tension that it comes up in a whole set of economic policy decisions about when should the government get involved and how much should the government be involved in various markets and economic decisions. And often we have an instinct, especially as economists, that tells us the market is pretty good at managing a lot of economic society. So be careful to get the government involved. And yet, when crises happen, often the government gets involved because of either political imperatives or economic situation gets so dire that there's really no other option. And the folks that really believe deeply in the market as the efficient mechanism say, no, those are exactly the moments when you need to not let the government get involved, because that's how the market learns. That's how people then redesign their market interactions to be robust to crises. We've never been able to do that really on Earth, to test the idea. What if you really kept the government back all the time? That would be sort of the libertarian paradise that I mentioned earlier. It would be fascinating to have people volunteer to join a society where it was explicit from the start that that was the experiment being tried. Now, I don't know if it would succeed, right? It might end up right where we are with our societies today, where the government gets involved, but that's the kind of thing you could try. Another thing you could try is a society that starts from a radically egalitarian standpoint, right? So everyone who joins signs on to the idea that we all start with the same basket of resources. And then, of course, you'd have to decide how you were going to handle inequality as it naturally formed going forward. But you could imagine, we've never had a society that starts like that. And what would that mean for how it evolved?
Wow. I mean, this, of course, presupposes that you sort of have a place in space that's large enough to have a reasonably size. We're not talking about a couple dozen people. This has to be at least, I would guess, thousands, if not, hundreds of thousands or millions. But
I mean, it's interesting. We've talked about those cities, right, and O'Neill cylinders, or mega satellites, and also it's come up in the last couple of podcasts about people kind of splitting off and doing their own thing, right? I mean, it might seem a little cruel if some economist at Harvard is being like, we're going to try an experiment. Who's going to do this? We're going to screw with your economy. But I don't think that's really how it would turn out, right? You'd have people who are excited about that libertarian utopia, or that pure egalitarian society that want to do that. And when we have the technology, for these cities, and people need to be getting off Earth anyway, that might just naturally arise and provide a bunch of data, even without kind of a scientific push.
Absolutely. I think that's part of the beauty of it. I mean, that's always been part of the beauty of a frontier, right? Is that people can go off and create what they think will be better. And they're often wrong, right? I mean, utopias often fail. And there are, of course, lots of ethical complications. I mean, children don't get to choose which one their parents have decided to live in, all those sorts of things. So it's not just all sunshine and roses, but I think that it is an exciting thing to contemplate. And I should just say, for people who aren't convinced, although that's probably not most of the people watching this podcast, but for people who aren't convinced, one thing that I found really rewarding about having these conversations is that because they allow you to crystallize some of the key, tensions that we face here on Earth, it gives you just a slightly different angle on some of the problems we're trying to solve, whether it's about the distribution of economic resources or climate change or anything else. But looking at how we would craft societies better in space gives us that useful angle.
Yeah, no doubt. I was going to say, I wonder if, because this is largely going to be self-selected groups, if we're going down the line of reasoning of we're going to have social experiments on a large scale, in space, it's a sort of a perfect opportunity because there's no prior existence in terms of economic or social history. Do you think, Matt, that you could essentially finance these, at least in part, through the fact that you have some pretty strong adherence to a particular philosophy, and say, well, I'm willing to put my life savings into this because I believe so strongly in this new social experiment?
That's a really interesting idea, Jeff. Yeah, I haven't thought too much about how that would happen, in part because it's so ways off, as Eric alluded to. So, but I think, I can totally imagine that people would be willing to, invest the resources they'd already accumulated. And then, of course, what you would hope is that these would be self-functioning economies like any other settlement is on Earth, so to speak. And so it wouldn't be that they would have to just live off of what they had accumulated, but that would provide the seed capital, and then they would just start operating like a normal society.
Right. And when you say normal, I guess you're kind of implying like trade with other partners such as the Earth. And
wouldn't that be great? Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Someday.
Yeah. Well, I know that we like to be inclusive here, and so I think surface settlements as well, like on the moon and Mars,
Yeah.
should be in our scope. And I know that when Elon Musk was first laying out his idea of his million-person plus Mars colony, or whatever you want to call it, Mars city, he essentially implied that ordinary people could afford to go if they spent their life savings or a good chunk of it, for the ride, and then everything else that they would be giving would essentially be their labor and their passion.
Right. I mean, who knows? The economics. First of all, the economics of space are changing pretty rapidly,
Mhm.
so it's a little hard to predict. As we move down the curve, will we keep moving down, and how fast, and how quickly will the other infrastructure technologies develop to make any of these dreams feasible? I was just speaking with someone else the other day who was expressing some very strident skepticism about the Mars settlement. So, we'll see how that all works out. But yes, that's clearly the idea, I think. And that's in some ways the only way that this could ever make sense, is that for your not average person necessarily, but for a very substantial number of people, investing their life savings would be enough to get them a seat in one of these places. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, that would certainly be a really great goal to work toward, and
Yeah.
in terms of opening space to almost everybody, and maybe
Yeah.
with scholarships for those who can't quite afford it. But
Right.
Well, I think
Right.
there's some interesting historical analogs, right? When you think about, like, even the America, the European settlement of America, right? A lot of, in particular, the early Brits were, selling off all their possessions, essentially, taking the bare necessities, and
Yeah.
using their life savings to get to a new world. And I could definitely see that happening in space too, and a lot of steps to get there, I think. But I also think that I think it's going to come sooner than a lot of people assume or just expect. As the more and more we look into this. So
Right.
Well, I'm kind of curious. So I want to make sure that we, leverage your knowledge and your thinking as an economist, and ask you. So, all right. So you're an economist. You're looking at this sort of far-flung future and its possibilities. But how do we get there from here? I mean, what sort of needs to happen, economically speaking, in the next few decades, let's say, or whatever scope you'd like to define for yourself?
Sure. Well, and I'm sure you've talked about this with lots of folks. I think of course, the first thing is launch costs have to keep coming down. And I think many people are very optimistic about the role Starship will play in getting us another order of magnitude down on the cost curve. So that's a huge benefit, not just because it allows us to get things up into space, but it allows us to bring up raw materials in a way that would help us manufacture things in space. And I think that that's in some ways, obviously, the next big step, which is starting to make things in space that would potentially support these sorts of colonies that we're talking about. I have to say I'm excited, though cautiously, I suppose I should say, about the push for commercial stations. I mean, obviously, Orbital Assembly is working hard to push our thinking and our progress on habitats like this. But the idea that, partly for expected reasons and partly for tragic, unexpected reasons, the imperative of getting commercial stations up in rapid order has only increased. And I think that, if you look back even at the beginning of the space age, as soon as we figure out ways to get up to space, we start thinking about how to stay there. We start thinking about how to build stations. And that seems to me like the natural next step in this long process of learning how to support larger groups of people in space.
Okay. Well, good. Well, then it seems like NASA's chosen the next most important thing to focus on in terms of. I mean, I'm giving NASA credit because they've essentially allowed the private industry in to something that was dominated by them prior to a few years ago.
Right. And one of the things that we do at the business school is we teach based on the case method. So all of our classes are case studies where we examine a situation and talk about it with each other. And we just finished a case on essentially NASA's choice after Apollo. So we called it NASA's second act, and how did NASA think about how to capitalize on all the excitement and optimism, and in the context of sort of waning public support for big budgets. And even from the start, of course, as many of your listeners probably know, NASA had these dreams that included not just something like the shuttle, but large rockets, as well as stations, as well as moon bases, and so on. And that seed of an idea that we have to have a place where we're keeping people in space is, of course, what eventually led to the ISS. And I think, though there's lots of reasons to criticize, aspects of the space program over the last 50 or 60 years, the fact that we have kept humans alive continuously in space for 2 decades is a real achievement and a great stepping stone for sort of the next level of that endeavor.
So how do you see that shift? Like obviously private industry, was what started space exploration, and we're shifting, like you mentioned, into more of a public-private kind of partnership model. How do you see that evolving in the future?
It's an excellent question. I think partly because it's still debatable, to what degree the model that we've seen over the last 15, 20 years will continue to be applied as we are more and more ambitious. So, just for those listeners who haven't followed this part much quite as closely, starting at least with the COTS program in the mid-2000s and arguably earlier, NASA started making bets on the private sector's ability to deliver some of these services, not just as a bespoke custom design for the government, but where the government would be one customer among many, and the government would be providing insight, not oversight, and other key taglines like that. And that proved, of course, we all know now, to be incredibly successful in terms of driving down costs, driving up innovation, and really changing the way that the sector starts to think about itself. So for me, the natural next step is to see, we've already been increasingly turning over activity in LEO to the commercial sector. The next step, as I was talking about with stations, and of course we see with Artemis, is how can NASA prime the pump? How can the National Security Establishment also prime the pump to kind of get momentum moving, help some startups through those early days, but then at the same time, try to build the economic ecosystem so that it's a self-sustaining one rather than just reliant upon public sector dollars. Now, where are we going to find the demand for that? Right, this ecosystem, who's paying whom to do these things on station and on the moon? That's the big question. But we can certainly dig into it more.
Yeah, I'd love for you to dig in a little on that.
Okay, yeah, I think I'll say two high level things, and then we can dig into more. I think the high level point is that part of the beauty of the market is that we can't actually predict what it's going to come up with. That's in some ways the entire idea, that the information and ideas are decentralized. They are spread among the billions of people on the planet, and only a mechanism like the market allows those ideas, the good ones, to bubble up. And so we haven't really had a sector where that's been possible for the past 50, 60 years in the way that I'm hoping we will now over the next, however many years it takes. So that's the first thing, is that is in some sense the big power of the market. The second thing I'd say is that we do know, and this gets at a concept that we can talk about more if you want, but there's this idea of complementarities across business models within space. That if you think about a lot of the companies trying to make their way into the sector, their business model works if someone else's business model works, right? So for me to do manufacturing in space, I need a place to do it, right? And for a station to successfully have a business model in space, it's going to need to have people doing stuff on the station, like manufacturing companies. And so there's a lot of interconnectedness in space, partly because it's just a nascent sector. If we can just fill in some of the gaps or encourage people to kind of move together towards this place where they're all feeding each other, then we can capture those complementarities.
And when you say if we can encourage, I guess what I'm wondering more specifically, who? The government? Is it parts of the private sector? We're not just handing out cash. It's more about creating a certain set of relationships, right? That's great. Yeah.
Great question. So traditionally and sort of conceptually, that would be a natural role for the government. And so the terminology that your listeners and you would be familiar with is something like we call it externalities. Usually we say that those are negative externalities, like with pollution and stuff like that. But there's positive externalities too, right? I might do something great in my business. I get to keep a lot of the value that I create there, but not all of it. Some of that gets, obtained by my partners in business, my other businesses that I work with. And so if the government can kind of subsidize some activities, it can create net value by creating these positive, or by subsidizing these positive externality creating operations. So that's the first thing, is that the government is the natural player. And that's, I think, essentially where NASA and some of the national security establishment sees itself, how it can see itself cooperating with the commercial sector. The less conventional source of this is billionaires. So most sectors don't have the benefit of having two of the richest people on the planet be passionate about their future. And I really do think that the billionaires are, they're in it. I think they are in it for legitimate business interests. I think they want to make money with their space businesses. They want them to be commercially successful. But I also think that they are cognizant that there is an element of a public good that they are providing. And that's similar. It's a similar motivation. If they can kind of jumpstart this sector, there's a lot of value that they might create. They may not capture all of it, but personally, that's worth it to them.
Yeah. So in a way, you're saying that these two billionaires, and I guess there are a few others we don't want to leave out, some other important people like Sir Richard Branson and others, that they are in it for the money, but they are kind of acting as philanthropists also, at least in part.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the traditional role of government, right? Is to
Yeah,
be a philanthropist.
Exactly.
Society.
And it's always been a debate, I think, or debate's too strong of a term, but there's always been questions about, is Jeff Bezos, like, does he think of Blue Origin as a hobby or as a business? You often hear that sort of thing. And does, the valuation of SpaceX, is that totally out of line with its actual business prospects? Is the Mars plan for real, or is it just kind of a motivating idea? So there's always these questions, which I think are getting at this idea that the visions they have are so enormous. It's hard to believe it's just about the business. There seems to be something else going on there.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when Bezos gave his speech, probably close to 2 years ago now, I'm trying to remember where he first, he said it before, but he had these really nice updated visuals of the O'Neill cylinders, and he reiterated millions of people living and working in space. I mean, maybe that's a great business idea as well, but it certainly seems a little more lofty to me.
Yeah, and I think it's so unfortunate that, I think I'm sure maybe you've talked about this before too, that the way that the public reception or the way that the public has received some of the recent or earliest astronaut flights has been almost at the other end of the extreme, right? That this is not a public good or something that will benefit all of humanity, but that it's just a joyride for billionaires. And for those of us who care about the sector, and I think who do authentically believe that these folks also really care about the future of this sector and what it can mean for all of humanity, that was a really unfortunate irony.
Yeah, kind of missing the entire point by focusing on the first few.
Understandably, right? Understandably. I mean, I don't blame the public for how they perceived it, but it was a mistake in how we rolled that out. Yeah.
Indeed.
So you mentioned complementaries and coordination, and I was wondering, if you could talk a little more about that. We mentioned these externalities. Is that a government funding? But beyond that, as I think part of the sort of broader space industry and ecosystem, that there's kind of some meat to that we could talk about and get into. I think would be interesting.
Sure. So we were talking right before this podcast about this idea in economics called the Stag Hunt, which some of your listeners might have heard of, but maybe I'll talk about that for a moment. The Stag Hunt, so this is an element of game theory. It's actually an element of what's called cooperative game theory. Most people who are familiar with game theory will probably be thinking of John Nash from A Beautiful Mind and competitive game theory. But there's another branch which is cooperative, which is what kind of games are there where actually, if people can cooperate, they can produce value. And the Stag Hunt is maybe the most classic of those games. And the simple story is that there's two hunters, and they can choose each of them whether to hunt a rabbit or a stag, a deer. And either of them can hunt the rabbit by themselves successfully, but to get the deer, they need to cooperate. And to get the deer creates a lot more surplus than for each of them to get a rabbit. And when you draw out the way that the game works, it turns out that unlike a lot of the games that people might be familiar with, like the Prisoner's Dilemma, where there's only one stable way to play the game, one stable equilibrium, which tends to be the undesirable outcome.
Yep.
In the Stag Hunt, there's actually two stable outcomes. One is where both of them are hunting rabbits on their own. And you see why that's stable, because if it were, Eric and I playing this game, and Eric goes and gets a rabbit, if I go try to get a deer by myself, I can't get it. So I'm just going to get my rabbit as well. But another stable equilibrium is where we're cooperating and both going after the deer, because we're both going after the deer. If I decide to go hunt the rabbit, I only get the rabbit instead of my share of the deer. So it's also stable to stay there. And the idea of this game is that often we find ourselves both hunting rabbits, and if we could just coordinate, we could get over the tipping point where we're getting that deer. And
I see.
And that's the complementarities. Exactly. And that's what I like to think about when I think about the space sector, which is that we've got a ton of companies, each hunting their rabbits. And what we would really like is to say, wait a minute, there's a deer out there, and maybe I need to cross-subsidize a little bit. Maybe I need to provide a little bit of backup so that if things don't go well for your company, the downside is limited. There's different ways to think about how we could together move up into that other equilibrium.
So it sounds like it's not, like it's often said in the space investment arena that, a problem is that things in space just take a long time to reach fruition, and most investors aren't patient enough. They want a return within 5 to 7 years, and sometimes things take a couple decades, and only government has that kind of patience. But I don't think you're just talking about the time element here in terms of barriers to overcome. You're talking about other things too, right?
Yeah, and those barriers are real for sure. The patient capital problem is a real thing, and of course that's also another reason it's nice to have private investors who have a lot of resources and can be patient. I think that, as I talk to people in the space financing side of things, for a long time that was sort of an insuperable barrier. This, VC works on a 5, 7, maybe 10-year horizon, and that's just not enough. But actually, I think the sector is finding ways to get past that problem, in the sense of, one way that VC often, the venture capital often works, is that you have these small companies at early stages who do some exciting things, and then they get bought up by the bigger companies. And so the early investors get their exit. They get paid for the risk that they took, and then the bigger fish that can deal with some of the longer term risks swallow up the good ones, or pick up the good companies that were succeeding. And it can kind of smooth out, or can provide sort of different payoff points along a longer term horizon, and then therefore overcome some of that patient capital problem. And I think we also have more and more investors who are realizing that, maybe there will be payoffs that they can wait for in the space sector. So I think you're right, Jeff, that the timing thing is a real issue, but I'm also somewhat optimistic about our ability to get over that. The bigger problem, I think, is that people just don't yet really know where the payoff is going to come from, right? So it's not that they wouldn't be willing to wait for it, or wait for the partial milestones to get there. They just don't even know yet what that deer is in the game, right? Like, what is the big pot of money sitting out there?
Yeah. Well, is it that, all right, well, let me dig in on that a little. You saying that most investors aren't informed enough to know, or that nobody in the world knows what the deer is, because it's just, okay.
Yeah, that nobody knows. Right. And I think that's the big mystery for this, or the big puzzle for the industry to solve. Most of the money right now, of course, is in satellites and what satellites can do, and that's great, right? And I think many of us see a very bright future and a whole new level of growth in that sector, and the internet, broadband internet coming. So that's very exciting. But when we talk about millions of people being in space and sort of the big deer type stuff, that's not satellites. So
is this like a similar analogy to like the killer app that, Lotus 123 was? I'm sure before desktop computers were everywhere, people were thinking about well, you could play video games on a computer in your house, or you could do media editing on this, or like maybe you could design stuff. And then once that kind of the spreadsheet, the electronic spreadsheet happened and people realized how valuable it was, you had an explosion of desktop computers, and then all these opportunities for these other business models based on the home PC to happen. And I mean, is that a good analogy? Are we kind of right there before we kind of
exactly
find that?
that's exactly right. I use that killer app phraseology all the time, and it's I mean,
we all do.
Right. The discouraging thing, I guess, is that of course the space sector has been thinking about that for a long time. So you might say that, well, maybe there isn't one.
Right. Can you
I'm
grow
more
an industry without a? Sorry. Yeah. I mean, can you grow a sector like the space industry without a killer app? Like, does it have to be killer in order to make it all worthwhile, or could we just grow more humbly and incrementally?
Yeah. Right. So that's a great question. I think that's what we're going to discover over the next 20 or 30 years, right? And I certainly wouldn't want to say that only if we find some killer app should we keep trying to invest in space, right? Because I guess you never know where something like that will come from. And anyways, let's just keep chipping away at the problem. Eventually, right? Even little steps get you a long ways over a long time.
Yeah.
But I have to say I'm more optimistic that there's the kind of Lotus 1, 2, 3 type thing out there, and this is the place where it gets very controversial among people. But for me, a big part of that is people in space. I think, I don't know if I would go so far as to say people are the killer app, but maybe that's not the worst summary of it, which is that when I think about what's the kind of thing that would generate a huge amount of demand for innovation and new activities and new services and new goods in space, it's having people up there. And of course, it's really hard to have people in space, but that's kind of the point, that if we were to really focus on that as being the deer, that's the big goal, is more people in space more often for longer duration, we would be forced to develop really revolutionary technologies and overcome huge problems. Now, maybe that's a wild goose chase. Maybe that's too much money. Maybe there's a lot of people who think that that's crazy and we should just stick with robotic exploration and science and things like that. And that's a perfectly reasonable case, but that's where I come.
I mean, you can tell Jeff and I, based on the way that we, talk in this podcast, we're on board with that. And we see as humanity grows and expands, it's natural to get out of your environment to a new one. And in some ways, there's an inevitability that humanity is going to get into space if it's going to become a mega society. But then on the short-term scale as well, I mean, Jeff and I both work at Orbital Assembly Corporation. We're building space stations with gravity in the very short term. And like we also believe that there's going to be a lot of power to having humans in space who can survive there comfortably and for a long time. And I think you're right. I mean, obviously a company like that is looking at these inputs and outputs and business value. But it's an interesting point that once we're doing that, we're going to learn a lot about not just like the economic structure of, hey, a more efficient CO2 scrubber would be valuable, but by having more people in space, we're also creating these opportunities for additional applications, right? Then one of them could be the killer app, and I think that's an very interesting take for sure.
Yeah, and we often, I mean, space is famous for leading to innovations that end up being incredibly valuable on Earth, and I think that's another aspect of this. I mean, you try to create places where humans can survive at scale in space. I'm pretty sure you're going to invent things that have a market here on Earth as well. And so it may be that that's part of how you make the business case close, but great, right? That's fine. If we're eventually going to have this interdependent economy between settlements out there and Earth, then that's part of the benefit.
Right. But I think one thing that you're highlighting that seems to strike home for me is, building an economy around the expectation that people are going to be there and they're going to need things. sounds more like, settling the new world. We're basically, there was no point. Well, I guess there was like the point of like going out there and just getting a whole bunch of beaver pelts and selling them to,
Right.
Europe or whatever. But what really created value was having that indigenous economy, right? Where you now have people who are consuming goods and now you have to supply all that. And eventually it's grown so far beyond what the initial application or applications had been had been thought to be. So I don't know. I mean, is that essentially what you're saying? You're sort of building civilization around which it needs people by definition.
That's right. I mean, that's essentially the idea. And I mean, again, of course, it is definitely harder to pay for that when you don't have the beaver pelts that are worth a lot in the home country. I mean, that, right? Like this would be a lot easier if we found something on the moon that turned out to be really valuable. So no one's questioning that is an obstacle. But yeah, I think of, and again, tourism is something about which a lot of people debate. But to me, the big promise of space tourism is that it can start with the people for whom the ticket prices are not really an obstacle, right? So they can subsidize a huge amount of technological innovation for these once-in-a-lifetime experiences. And it's really people in space. So they're going to need creature comforts. They're going to need reliable systems. They're going to need all the things that we would need for a much bigger settlement. But we can do it very incrementally, a couple hours at a time, couple days at a time, 10 people, 100 people. So I'm pretty hopeful that tourism is a key step along the way.
Yeah, indeed. And as that price gets lower, which is largely driven by the launch cost, it really starts to open up that base level significantly. It's super linear.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very interesting that, as launch costs come down, you open up that base of people with the pocketbook to do this type of tourism. But then that is this, kind of a self-enforcing cycle, right? Because as more people are doing it, well, you're able to get launch costs down with, with more launches. And then you're also, like you mentioned, building that technology. You can make a space station cheaper because you've already done all that non-recurring engineering.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly sounds very like, tantalizing, like it's just out of reach, but we've been sort of waiting. On the one hand, we've been waiting for this a long time in the space community. On the other hand, maybe we haven't for that long because we really have only gotten the commercial, blessing from industry players like, institutional players like NASA in the last few years. And we're just starting to see that in low Earth orbit and soon after the moon. So I feel like it's still baby steps.
It's funny because in some ways it seems like a long time, but first of all, it's a blink of an eye, really, in all of human history. I mean, it's amazing actually how much progress we've made when you think about it. And then I think also there is something to be said for just technological good luck. I mean, the advances in computation and microelectronics make all of this possible in a way that, it just would not have been possible in the 70s and 80s probably to do any of the stuff that we're talking about. And who knows, 20 years from now, we may say the same thing about the 2020s. Like, how did they think they were going to do this when they didn't have X? So that would be great, right? But I do think that that's part of why all of a sudden this stuff doesn't seem so crazy anymore.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so definitely something we highlight.
Yeah,
go ahead, Eric.
Well, this kind of gets to a question I've been sort of wanting to ask, and we're talking about we're close, and if we agree for a moment that it's inevitable at some point, kind of on a more big picture level, what kind of economic frameworks can we be thinking about and adopting in order to maximize the chance of success to become a spacefaring civilization, or to try to shorten the timelines as much as possible?
That's an interesting question. Economic frameworks. I mean, so I guess I'm not sure, Eric, if you're talking about to understand how this is going to happen or to make it happen. What maybe you can say more.
Let's talk about trying to make it happen, right? If at least here in our future in space, this is a safe space to talk about getting and making it happen, getting humanity off the planet. So from an economic standpoint, what levers are there to support that?
Sure. So, I mean, as we talked about, I think the first thing is that the government can, and I suppose deep-pocketed private investors who are eager to help with this cause can look for the gaps in the value chain where if they just shoved a little bit of capital in and made it happen, then kind of the whole link or the whole chain starts to come together. So that's the first step we've talked about. I think the second, though, is something we haven't talked at all about, and that is property rights and the rule of law. And when you think about how do economic societies develop, when is the market really able to flourish? It's when there are well-established property rights and they're well enforced and people understand the rules. And we've got a lot of work to do thinking about what that's going to be like once we move up into space. We have old treaties that govern that, and it's amazing we have even them. They do a pretty good job. We're lucky we have them, but we're going to need to get more specific as we move out. And so that's the next horizon.
Mm-hmm.
And so you asked about ways to think about that. So I'll be a little more specific. Your listeners might be familiar with this 2015 Commercial Space Launch and Competitiveness Act that was signed in the US. And it's a really interesting law. It's basically the law that gives companies going to space under the US flag the right to extract resources from asteroids and sell them and profit from them. And that was a big step. I mean, it was very unclear up until that point whether that would actually be what happened if you went up and tried to mine an asteroid. Now, we still haven't done it. There's technological barriers to actually doing that. But, I think even just a couple of weeks ago, it came through my news feed that there was yet another startup that raised some more money to go try to figure out how to do this. So there is capital interested in asteroid mining. It's maybe one of those killer apps, although we really need to see that business case, but maybe, right, someday. And there's a lot of debate about what kind of property rights to grant to a company like that. The principle that economists often use is this thing called the Lockheed Proviso. And it comes from this philosopher, Robert Nozick, who was building off of something John Locke wrote. John Locke wrote that basically once you mix your human labor with a resource, you have a right to it. And he had this proviso, which is so long as there's enough left, there's as much left for everyone else as there was before, basically. And so Robert Nozick just modified that to be slightly more modern terminology, which is that we should be able to grant property rights to people as long as everyone ends up at least as well off through the granting of that property rights. And so in some ways, it's a pretty restricted requirement that doesn't seem, too controversial, but it applies, I think, actually quite well to this sort of situation, right? So if there's an asteroid out there that doesn't have any particular value to, from a spiritual standpoint or scientific standpoint, but happens to be full of a resource that would really benefit humankind, great, let's give somebody the property right to go out there and make some money off of it and help humanity at the same time. So that's one example.
Yeah. And I think there's lots of those. I mean, we've talked with a couple of prior guests about this idea that there would be lots of asteroids that would be worth mining for various reasons, depending on our technology. But there's so many bodies in the solar system. Of course, there's always this idea that, well, maybe that one holds like some special scientific value. But, once we've explored enough of them, I think we'd agree with you that there's plenty for economic exploitation. And
and that's a good point too. I just wanted to kind of hit this home for our listeners in case it wasn't clear that economic exploitation doesn't in this case necessarily mean and then that rich billionaire who funded it gets to keep all the platinum and be $4 trillion richer. The idea there is that we could use that platinum, some company, right, could bring it back and make a profit from their labor of collecting it and bringing it back to the market. But an increase in the amount of platinum available to our worldwide economy is a tangible benefit to the society, right? It's used in a lot of important engineering applications, and having more of it, we can do a lot more interesting, technological things that improve all of our lives because we have another source of platinum that also, of course, improves the lives, right? The value that a company got for extracting it. So
Yeah.
That's kind of the idea there, right? Is that there's not as much platinum left in the main asteroid belt, but there's more available to humanity as a whole, and that kind of increases the value for everybody.
Absolutely. And, especially since we're letting ourselves be speculative about large societies in space. I mean, mining resources in space to build out those societies is obviously going to be essential. And so, it's a part of a stepping stone to building that, and then we can go get more resources. And yeah, right. I mean, of course, we want to be careful, because to be totally sincere about this, I mean, I think a lot of the ways that Earth has developed and expanded over the past several centuries, we regret, right? We really regret the way that it was done thoughtlessly. And so it's not that we're wanting to rush headlong into this, but it's definitely a trade-off.
Yeah, wow. That just brings up a whole other set of how can we do this wisely, given that we don't all agree on principles, right? There are different forms of government who see some of these things quite differently, and then there's just self-interested parties and people with different values. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of outside your expertise area, perhaps, but do you want to weigh in on that?
Not sure I have anything particularly unique to say about that. I'll add, maybe, I mean, because I'm sure everyone listening is thinking the same things about coordination. And let me just, maybe two quick thoughts. One is that when I talk to my students and other folks, the last class actually of the course that I taught, the question I asked them to answer is, why space? Right. So, most of them are space enthusiasts, or all of us. And if you're a space enthusiast, I think it's incumbent upon you to have a good answer to why invest in space, because there's a lot of skeptics out there. And so to your question, Jeff, one of the pieces of that answer, I think, and it's in some ways the least optimistic of those pieces, is national security. Like there's a role of geopolitics, unfortunately, in space. And so, I would love to say that cooperation in space and the regulation and rule of law in space will all be cooperative, and all countries, moving beyond their earthly rivalries. I think that's unlikely, and but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything. It means that if we really think that our values are important ones to defend, that we maybe need to try to get those rules of the road in space that we think will protect that. So I think there is an imperative, perhaps, to move for those reasons. But the second thing I was just going to say, which is maybe a little more optimistic, is that we're at least at a point right now in space where there aren't that many big actors. It's not like climate change, where there's literally billions of people contributing to what's going on. There's a small number, and when there's a small number of big players in an area where there are lots of benefits from cooperating and costs from not cooperating, those parties often find ways to coordinate. And there's various folks who've theorized this over time, but I think we are still in that situation in space, and that gives me some hope that we will find a way to regulate things well, like space debris and other problems.
Right.
Yeah, space debris is an interesting problem that came up in a previous talk with Akhil Rao, and he was talking about a Pigouvian tax on what is essentially of the pollution of space debris. And I think one of his interesting points was, this isn't a punitive tax, but that sort of action really increases the value of space to all of those actors. Is that something you think, as you mentioned, a small number of big players, is that something that those players could even just arrange themselves without a sort of outside governing body?
Yeah, that's an awesome topic. I love this topic. It's very much a tax economist's angle on space, because yes, Pigouvian tax would be great. Yes, so can they do it without it? So the reference here for your listeners is this economist named Ronald Cos, who came up with this idea called the Cos Theorem, which is that private actors can essentially do the same thing with externalities. They can internalize the costs of externalities without government intervention, so long as they have clear property rights and they can bargain costlessly with each other about the situation. So that's an interesting reference for folks to look into. I think the more practical version of that, what we actually see happening in the space sector, is that I think there's a pretty strong norm developing that if you are going to be a part of this sector, you have to be responsible about space debris. And of course, there are actors who aren't yet bought into that norm. But I think increasingly, if you look at satellite constellation providers or people thinking about doing satellite servicing or anything else in space, they're working into their plans ways to not be irresponsible about what they do for the space debris problem. And in fact, if possible, to help it. So you see Greg Weiler saying things like this about his new ideas and so on. So that's the kind of private coordination. The government can be involved in some ways, but that can be purely driven by the private sector in their own self-interest with just this kind of, let's all establish a norm and abide by it.
Right. I mean, maybe that works. I don't know if this is unique to orbital debris because there's such an obvious downside of colliding with other objects in space that people recognize we should probably be doing something about this and not contributing to the problem. I mean, but are most of these externalities going to look like this, or is this kind of like a special case?
That's a good question. It might be somewhat special because the consequences would be so dire, right? That if we let this get out of control, it would it's obvious why it would be so bad for everybody. I mean, one thing I will just add is that how does this get enforced? Like it sounds nice to talk about norms, right? But like whatever. The beauty of it is that, again, if you have a relatively small number of actors, if you become sort of player non grata in the space sector because you aren't abiding by these norms, that's very costly to you, right? If you're a small launch provider who's somehow not following the norm, then nobody buys from you, is the kind of thing. And so that if they are self-enforcing at some level. But I don't know, Jeff, that's an excellent question, whether we'll be able to avoid this problem as we expand more generally.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of maybe things that have a longer lead time before it's a problem. Like if you're mining an asteroid and you just let a big pile of rubble, accumulate around your asteroid, and then it starts to drift, or otherwise there's a problem with toxicity with other things you want to do later. Yeah, I'm just speculating, but.
No, it's interesting, and it's probably related to the property rights discussion we were having, right? So how are we who's raising their hand and saying, wait a minute, like you just did that thing with the asteroid, which actually negatively affected me. I'm going to hold you responsible for that. We don't really have a mechanism right now to do that at scale in space. And so that's the kind of thing that the space lawyers need to help us figure out.
Yeah, maybe several decades from now, they'll still be figuring things out, but hopefully we'll get more in place. Well, so Eric, it might be time to look at comments if there's any worth sharing.
We haven't had a lot of questions.
Okay.
I think some comments about getting more people into space. I think that kind of resonates a bit with our listeners and how that can help sort of upward spiral, I guess, the technology and getting off the planet. So I think as you seem pretty excited about that, and I'm sort of curious if there's anything more to say about that, and beyond just this creating opportunities for innovation, are there other kind of economic impacts of just the quantity of people that we should be thinking about?
Sure. I mean, one thing I can add, which isn't exactly related to what you just asked, but which I think might be interesting to the listeners, is I teach at a business school, not an aero astro department, and so I think one thing that's been a really welcome change over the last 5-10 years that I've been thinking about this sector is the openness of it to people without space backgrounds, and I think that's a real sign of the industry turning into a normal industry where it just has businesses that need to be run well. They need to have people who manage sales, who manage finance, marketing, strategy, operations, all that stuff. And that's, in some ways related to this idea of if we can build an ecosystem that has lots of businesses which support just the normal needs and wants of humans, more people can get involved in the space sector without that aero-astro training that used to be a prerequisite for even getting an interview at the space companies. And so that's exciting to me to see, out of, I had 50 plus students in the class this year at the business school, most of whom did not have any particular experience in the space sector, but can see themselves getting involved in it now that it's kind of opening up in that way.
Yeah, that's extremely encouraging. I like the perspective you're sharing. I mean, I've been noticing myself just going to space conferences the last few years. Well, not since COVID so far, but as of a couple of years ago. And there was an increasing number of people without those disciplines who were showing up and at least being really curious about how to plug in. So I concur.
Yeah, it's really encouraging.
Well, I think I'm wondering, was there any topic that maybe you were hoping we could touch on that you just want to bring up as a last discussion point?
I guess the only point that that I have been thinking about a lot, which I'm sure your listeners do too, is this idea of, when this show is motivated so much by this sort of big thinking, this, where's the long run? And I think that's a really powerful way to understand some of these debates within the sector, which is that, if you think about, your calculus and you think about the surface or the curve we might be on, there's a lot of little local maxima that we're excited about, right? So like we've got a new constellation of satellites, or our, launch costs are coming down, or things like that, which are, they're awesome. And we want to maximize our ability to do things like that. But there might be some global optimum a little farther down the curve, right? That just requires us to think a little bit differently about what we're after here. And so that's an image I keep in my mind sometimes about our goals in space and looking for that big global optimum, not just the local ones.
Yeah. I mean, one that appeals to me immediately is this idea that I guess I'm just partial to it, using the resources in space rather than bringing everything from the ground. Like that to me feels like a really big lever. I don't know if we call it a killer app yet, but it's taken a long time to get right, because you need a certain amount of investment and technological maturity to be able to do that. Right. I'm thinking particularly the moon as a nearer term example. You got to have a certain amount of infrastructure there. But then once you do, you can start to make things a lot more inexpensively. And that is it's a similar magnitude to the launch cost thing. So maybe that's the thing that we should be thinking more down the line. But
awesome.
Absolutely. Well, I think that kind of wraps it up here. We're out of time, but thank you so much, Matt, for joining us, and thanks to everybody who joined live and watched recording of this. But Matt, we were just really enjoyed the conversation and appreciate you sharing your time and your insight with us. So thank you so much. Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you for doing this podcast. I think it's awesome to get this discussion out there and feed the enthusiasm we all have. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get thinking about these things now, and we appreciate that. So to our listeners out there, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, ideas for future guests or topics. You can email us at ourfutureinspace@orbitalassembly.com. You can find us on Twitter at ourfuturespace or Facebook at ourfutureinspace. Again, Matt, thank you so much, and thank you all for listening.